So the final presentation for this part of the seminar, I invite Jan Mischke, Senior Fellow, McKinsey Global Institute, to speak about why is it not happening, governance and structures. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I think this very nicely feeds into your closing question of why is it not happening. Now, before I get into why is it not happening, I should probably take a few minutes to explain what I mean by it. And what I'm taking here is an angle of infrastructure, and in fact as much one of national infrastructure as of city infrastructure. But the learnings, I think, apply pretty universally to many of the problems that we have discussed this afternoon and also this morning. And maybe just a few big introductory remarks on infrastructure. So I think it's widely known we need a lot of infrastructure. Many estimates around there, around $60 trillion by 2030 are needed globally. Okay. And to put that into context, that is more than the 50 trillion value of all infrastructure in the ground today globally. So what we need to build over 17 years is more than what we have. That's a fairly dramatic number. And that comes on top of significant deficits already in the past. And here's just some estimates given for certain countries, how much have they underinvested or overinvested in some cases in their infrastructure compared to their growth trajectory. We have here for the UK, it's roughly 0.9%, close to 1% of GDP that is missing in terms of what has been invested less than what the country would require. But the UK is not unique there, so you see also countries like Germany, which generally have a good reputation for infrastructure, severely underinvesting. And you're already shaking your head. I'm from Germany myself, I also would doubt that, but the international reputation usually lags the reality by roughly a decade. And obviously we had a colleague from Brazil here, there the numbers are far more dramatic than that. Also India here, 2.2% of GDP that we would need to speed up. But also a couple of cases like China and Japan, which arguably are wasting a lot of money on building too much, and too much of things that they may not need. But I think the important point here is that the common narrative now is we need a lot of infrastructure, public budgets are tight, we don't have the money, so let's innovate around all forms of private finance. And particularly now that project finance from banking, also with the banking regulation and so on, has collapsed. New forms are needed, all kinds of new structures being invented, including very welcome ones from the EIB and so on. But for me, that can never be more than the tip of the iceberg. The entire collect of project finance is roughly 0.3% of global GDP. Those gaps here are completely different order of magnitude, far precede the crisis. And as we've heard many times today also, there's a lot of money around. So if innovative financing mechanisms are not the answer to the challenge, then what is? And here would argue the real answer, and that goes a little bit in line with what you said, John, earlier, is to make more with the money that we have. And what we actually found in our research is that globally around 40%, or $1 trillion a year of infrastructure spent can be saved by using the money that we have more wisely. And what we did here is exactly not going into new technologies that might be out there 10 or 20 years from now, or might be there now, but might be deployed 10 or 20 years from now, all kinds of ideas that some consultants might have. But we rather looked at 400 cases globally of success, where someone did something smart, and this way saved a lot of money, and aggregated them up. What would it mean if we shared those practices on a global scale? And that delivers 40% savings in three categories. It's first making sure we build the right infrastructure. I think we already had a lot of discussion earlier today on the transformative power of infrastructure, which I would agree to in general, but also the question marks around transformative power of infrastructure in disadvantaged regions, where quite frankly I think history is full of examples of a lot of money being misspent on failing attempts to rejuvenate regions with things like infrastructure. And I think a picture of Detroit is actually a good example. I think building a new motorway in Detroit would not help very much. And a lot of examples out there what can be done, like South Korea has this institution, PMAC, that oversees the portfolio of projects, makes sure the analyses are sound and so on, avoids a lot of the political infighting and so on behind. Then it's streamlining delivery. 50% roughly savings, our experience from many projects, but also from looking around countries. There's levers like procurement. Australia has consolidated procurement practices in central units, benefiting from economies of scale and so on. We have countries, small countries like Denmark, who have actively taken on the construction sector, but also the supply chain behind, which have been oligopolistic, and they are now breaking that up by inviting international bidders, but also for doing so, doing all the other things that are important for that in terms of changing their standards to international standards and so on to allow that kind of change. And last but not least, making more of the infrastructure that we have. And I guess if we were to go the way that you described, we could expand that bucket by a big margin. But already today, a lot of money goes wasted because we don't maintain the infrastructure that we have appropriately. Or the other way around, like we observed in Sweden, we actually put too much money into the maintenance of not heavily used streets just because the schedule says this type of road gets maintenance every 7 years, and well, if it's not driven on, it only requires maintenance every 15 years. So another roughly 15% savings potential there. Now, without going much into the details now of all the case examples and any of the 400 behind, happy to discuss those over coffee. The question is, when I present that, I usually see a lot of nodding, and I see a lot of nodding here as well. And I think many, while the numbers might be somewhat new, many of the examples and the problems are reasonably well known, and probably have been reasonably well known 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago. So why is it not happening? What's standing in the way? Why are countries, why are cities not embarking on saving $1 trillion? And there's a couple of areas that I would like to highlight, and I think some of those have been mentioned also over the day. It's a matter of governance, it's a matter of collaboration, and then there's a couple of enablers that are required to get there. And if I can start with the governance, it's the coordination between institutions. And I think that goes into the direction of what Sir John told us earlier today. All the silo thinking between, like, the Department of Transport in the UK, which didn't want to finance for High-Speed 2 the money to put a fiber optic cable next to the tracks. I mean, that's a fairly extreme case of silo thinking, but obviously a lot of that is occurring where cross-departmental forms of organization, be it the radical way that Sir John proposed, or be it more straightforward ways, like we have a lot of good experience with cross-departmental delivery units reporting to the mayor or reporting to the prime minister, depending on which level they are at, delivers huge value. Then there's an issue of politics getting in the way of the right decision making. There's a lot of tendency towards ribbon cutting of fancy projects. There's a lot of tendency to discuss and deal with politicians at different regional levels, like, okay, you get your motorway, I get my railway station, and so on. So a proper delineation is needed between where does the political power end, where does the technocratic decision-making start, or what is a good way of supervising, in the end, the collective decision-making between the two. And this is where systems like in a country like Chile come in place. Central unit evaluates all the projects, filters are out around 35% of them and says, no, this makes no sense. And to give it a little bit more weight, the results are published online, so the public can have a view as well on whether or not their politicians adhere to the evaluations and the standards they have set themselves. Then it's about the continuity in budget and plans. You need the money not only for the next 4 years, you need it for the next, why was it, 50 years? We heard earlier is a good time horizon for cities to think about, which kind of maybe leads me to quick detour, into the issue of data and accounting as one important enabler. And we heard earlier from Bruno already about all the nice things we can do with big data, new IT applications and so on. But I'm much more basic here. If I look around, I'm not sure what the situation in London is, but most countries and cities that I am aware of, they don't even know what is the worth of the infrastructure they have in the ground. They have no ideas. They may know what the status of each road is in terms of how many potholes are in there. Maybe they've even counted them. But very few know how to translate that into maintenance liabilities over the next 5, 10, or 30 years. Almost none of them has any clear idea of how much money do I need for the next 20, 40, or 50 years. They usually have good plans based on how much have I spent over the last 10 years. Then they say maybe a bit more, a bit less, and then they add a fancy high-speed rail on top. But there it stops. There's no comprehensive planning on what is roughly the amount of financing and investment that I need both for maintaining what I have and for building new things, and how does that compare to the liabilities and the debt that I have. Let alone the public accounting standards actually not allowing us to treat investment differently from consumption, which is the key reason why we think the money is not there. Without that self-constriction, also the public sector would have more than enough money right now. Then the incentives to innovate and take risk. To put it with the words of one of the CEOs of a construction company that I talked to in the process, well, if I could build all rail lines in this country 20% more cheaply. You just need to adjust the design standards to how I do it in another country, where, by the way, performance criteria, quality criteria are as high, if not higher. But well, if no one asks me to, I take the 20%. So why is no one asking this guy? Well, the person in that respective department of rail or transport and so on, they have their guidelines. They have their guidelines probably established in 1914 or something. They have built the rail track to this standard ever since. And would he deviate from that and anything goes wrong, he has a problem. Would he deviate and actually save a billion? No one would notice. So without the right incentives, no risk is being taken. So we need a different culture of risk-taking also at the public sector. And that comes back also to the discussion we had about more strategic thinking in policy making rather than low-level execution of tasks. And to get there, the one thing that we will need is the right capacity and capabilities. And it starts at the high level with a very strong vision. That's something we heard from Sir Edward very strongly in the different communities in London, but that's also our experience by researching different cities globally, how they've been performing versus their peers. The key thing is vision. And that is something that cannot be trained easily. I think we just need to select the right leaders for our cities and for our economies to get there. But at the next level down, it's also a matter of quality, but also quantity of people taking all the many decisions that are necessary to make things happen. The project managers, the planners, and so on. And I guess as a consultancy, we would usually have the reputation of suggesting to cut stuff. This is definitely an area where we suggest almost universally wherever we look to add people and to add also quality of people and to add expenses for those people. To give you an idea, like a 5 billion infrastructure project usually requires a project management organization to the tune of 500 people. And those 500 people are not like, well, some of them are, but not all of them are like low-level analysts that you get out of graduate school. But a person managing a 5 billion project is actually a CEO-level person who in private sector also would usually expect a compensation of $1 million plus, which is something that, quite honestly, many of our infrastructure departments struggle awarding those people. They find other ways, of course, in terms of reputation, and I think the number of sirs in this group already suggests that this goes a long way in this country. But there's other mechanisms here needed as well. And examples include, of course, well-known Singapore, but also like Infrastructure Ontario and Canada, which have formed a different private sector institution to oversee their transport projects because it allows them to escape some of the public sector wage structures and so on. And last but not least, of course, then also collaborating with the private sector in a suitable way. One example is in New Jersey, the I-495 extension was supposed to come in at $5 billion. That was too expensive. It was declined as a project. Private sector company came in, suggested a couple of changes to the routing. $1 billion was the final price ticket. Project went ahead. A few countries have a decent scheme to actually trigger proposals private and private sector for new infrastructure or for different and more innovative forms of delivering infrastructure. Chile is one of the exceptions. South Africa is also working on one, particularly in fact in established economies. There's less of that, even though we all love PPPs for all kinds of reasons, or not, but kind of really the initiative taking is lacking. So with that, thank you, and I don't want to keep you longer from coffee.